Hello and welcome to our 8th lecture on the history of Islamic religion. In our final lecture, we discussed the issues of the attitude of early Islam and later Islam also to the minorities, those who were occupied by the early Muslims already in the 7th century, especially in the 8th century. And these minorities are divided into two, the Christian minority under Muslim rule and the Jewish minority that are actually one group, the monotheistic believers. And on the other hand, that's the pagan group. And we said that there's a huge difference between the attitudes. One, according to, towards the pagans, it's a policy of extermination unless they convert to Islam, whilst the Christians and the Jews are treated totally differently according to a set of rules known as Omar's rules. And that set of rules determined in details how a Muslim ruler should act when he faces the Christian or Jewish problem. What are they allowed to do, what they're not allowed to do, and so on and so forth. The basic idea in this set of rules is that Christians, and later the Jews were added to the same concept, Christians are to be humiliated, they should be inferior, they will not have the same status as the Muslim citizens. On the other hand, they will be protected, they will get aman, security, and a Muslim is not allowed to harm them. So that's the basic concept. The set of rules set by Omar the Great, according to Muslim tradition, goes on to elaborate on that. So what exactly do we find in this set of rules? Well, firstly, the basic idea, as we said, is to humiliate the non-Muslim minorities. How exactly do you do that? We'll see in a moment. The first thing is that non-Muslims should pay a special, unique tax. That tax, known as jizya, applies to every man, every member of a family. Once a year, it has to be paid for him. This special tax, and of course, as I said, suffering some humiliation in different ways in return for the protection. So, for instance, one thing that we find in the rules of Omar is the prohibition against building new churches or new monasteries and so on and so forth. So the idea is that if a certain area is occupied by the Muslims and there are churches there, then these churches may remain. They're not destroyed. But the Christians are not allowed to build a new church or a new monastery or a religious institute. In addition to that, later on, another principle was added when more and more mosques were built, that a Christian church or a Jewish synagogue to that effect should never be higher than the local mosque. So that's one thing. In addition to that, the laws of Omar also refer to the question of repairs. So if a certain Christian building falls into disrepair, okay, it has to be renovated, it can't be done. Okay, remember this because I'm going to give you some examples that contradict that very shortly. Another prohibition is against teaching non-Muslims the Quran. According to some scholars in Islam, the Quran is a holy book. The non-Muslims are unholy, they're unclean, so they should never touch the Quran. In addition, because they're not Muslims and they never studied the Quran correctly, they're not allowed to open the Quran and study it or teach each other. That sounds a bit odd because you'd expect that Islam as a missionary religion would encourage people to read the Quran. Actually, it does. Even today, when I walk in the streets of Jerusalem, in some places, there are Muslims who hold books and they would give it to you for free. Just read it, but not in Arabic, in Hebrew, in English, because the Arabic script is holy and the Quran as a holy book should not be touched by non-Muslims. The reason is quite simple, because if you are not versed in the Quran, if you were not taught by a Muslim, you might, just might, misinterpret the Quran and get the wrong ideas. And this is why you're not allowed to touch it and teach it, of course. Christians were also forbidden from showing their religion in public. For instance, ringing bells. Now, in the European cities in medieval times, of course, there were towers, tall towers with bells on them, and they would ring the bells and call for prayer. That's part of the audio-visual experience of a typical medieval European city, but not under Islamic rule. Christians were not allowed to ring the bells, and as a result, the Christians had to devise another method to call for prayer. For instance, they would use a large plaque of wood, take a piece of wood and knock on it, and people would hear and know that this is prayer time. Now, this is actually how things worked in this country where I live, in the land of Israel, in the state of Israel. Back then, in the 19th century, we were controlled by the Turks. The Turks occupied the land in the 16th century until the beginning of the 20th century, for 400 years. They were Muslims, so they did not allow Christians to ring the bells. So the locals would use this wooden plaque. As a result, in the 19th century, things began to change in this country because the power of the Western kingdoms, the political powers such as England and France and Russia, all of them are Christians, their power increased and they were partners of the Turks, and the Turks had to succumb to some changes, and therefore they began to allow Christians to ring bells during the day and night to call for prayer. But by then, by the 19th century, using the wooden plaque, the nakos as they call it, became so familiar, so traditional, that even today in some churches, such as the Armenian church in Jerusalem, they would still use the nakos, the wooden plaque, to call for prayer. It became sacred in itself, even though it was just a default, an option that was chosen because they had no way of using the bells. So not ringing the bells, that's part of not being able to demonstrate, to show your religion in public. And of course, there were restrictions on processions and so on and so forth in different parts of the world. Another issue is the issue of alcoholic beverages, i.e. mainly wine. I'd like to say that, and we'll address that later. Wine is not allowed in Islam. Muslims are not supposed to drink wine or any kind of alcoholic substance, such as vodka, whiskey, and so on and so forth. The problem is that alcohol, mainly wine, is used by two minorities under the Islamic rule. Christians and Jews use wine. Jews use wine mostly on Friday and Shabbat for the Kiddush, the ceremony that consecrates the day. Christians, of course, definitely use wine on the Holy Supper, and therefore there's a clash here between the Islamic law and the fact that these people have to perform their rituals using wine. The Muslims understood that they cannot forbid that, because that would be against the laws of Omar. That would be against the tolerance, relative tolerance. You can't go that far. It eliminates the substance, the essence of being a Jew or a Christian. So the idea was that the Jews and the Christians are allowed to produce wine, but only for self-consumption. They are not allowed, for instance, to sell it to Muslims. Another law referred to the general daily life. Muslims walk on the streets, Jews, Christians walk on the streets. They meet along the way. So, according to the laws of Omar, Jews and Christians were obliged to show respect to Muslims. If a Muslim wishes to sit and there are no seats available, the Jew or the Christian must get up and allow him to sit. There's prohibition against preaching to Muslims, meaning if a Jew or a Christian would like to influence a Muslim to become a Jew or a Christian, this is not allowed. The other way around is allowed. So it's a one-way missionary ticket. If a Jew or a Christian wanted to ride a horse, okay, some people need horses for their daily activities, he can do that, but he must ride the horse without a saddle to humiliate him. Muslims, of course, ride horses with saddles. Others are not allowed. It shows who's on the top here, who's a citizen and who's not. There's also a prohibition against engraving Arabic inscriptions on signet seals. In antiquity, people, merchants, ordinary people sometimes, they had their own personal seals with which they signed their letters and documents, official documents, and so on. So Jews and Christians had that, but they were not allowed to use the Arabic script to do so. Arabic script is a holy script, therefore it is only reserved for Muslims. According to another law, a Jew or a Christian was obliged to accommodate any Muslim passerby, if he wishes to, for 3 days and 3 nights, for free. That's part of the deal. Now, the list is very long. I'm not going to elaborate on that because I think we got the idea. Humiliation as a kind of a payment for, well, relative tolerance. The question is, were these rules really obeyed? Were they really followed in the Islamic states all over the world? And as usual, the answer is a complex one, depending when and where. So yes, these are the laws, but as you all know, ladies and gentlemen, sometimes there's a law and there's real life. In real life, the application and the enforcement of the law depends on many variables. For instance, if we're talking about the center of the empire, there are higher chances that the law would be enforced because there's the observing eyes of the government. But when we talk about the outskirts of the empire, things may perhaps be different. In times, there are local Muslim rulers who are less tolerant, and in their days, we know for a fact, these rules were forced with vigor. But under other Muslim rulers, things were different, more tolerant. But in general, we may say that these rules were the ideal followed by the mainstream Islamic regimes with regards to the minorities. And there are exceptions. For instance, in Jerusalem, in the 19th century, under the Turks, remember the Turks, the Muslims from Turkey who controlled this country for 400 years, suddenly we see 2 synagogues, magnificent buildings, built in the Jewish quarter in the old city of Jerusalem today. One synagogue is called the Churva synagogue, the other one is called Tiferet Israel, Israel's glory in Hebrew. And these synagogues were built under Muslim rule against Omar's laws. And when you look at them from afar, you can clearly see that both of them are higher than the Dome of the Rock, which is the most important Muslim building in the entire country. It's higher than the Dome of the Rock. How was that possible? Well, there's always a local explanation. It's not that they ignored Omar's laws, but in the case of one of these synagogues, for instance, the Churva synagogue, the ruined synagogue as it was named, we know that the architect who built it was hired by the Jews, but he was a Muslim. Not just any Muslim. He was actually the court architect of the Sultan in Turkey, a very influential high official. So when the Jews asked him to build a higher synagogue, no one dared to argue. So that is a local explanation showing us that there's rules, there's the law, but there's also the real life. It's a good lesson to us all. We are now finished dealing with the introduction, comparison to other religions, basic concepts. But now there's a question. What makes a Muslim a Muslim? What are the minimum requirements from a person to be considered a Muslim according to the Islamic religion? And the answer is relatively simple. There are 5 principles. If you follow them, you are a good Muslim. If you're not, even one of them, you're not considered a Muslim. These are called the pillars of Islam. And in the next lecture, I'm going to begin to elaborate on the pillars of Islam.